Okay, hello everybody. This is a rather interesting installment in our series on the idea of home, since it crosses over with this week's special Halloween week programming. And in fact, we have a double dose of Halloween programming for you today. If you stay around after this event, another one starts at 6 p.m. When three speakers, Susie Babka, Amanda Peterson, and Kyle Brooks will speak on ghosts and the disruptions of continuity, and that promises to be great. So do stay around. We have the gallery will be open, so you can take a last look. It's coming to an end, this wonderful exhibition, so it's good to see it, particularly during Halloween week. And in this present session, which links Halloween with the idea of home, we're going to think about the home's unhomely qualities. In other words, that thing called the uncanny. We have three speakers for you in this session. Sadly for you all, I'm one of them. And I'll give some orienting thoughts about the Freudian conception of the uncanny. We will then hear from Derrick Cartwright and Remi Dalton, two faculty members in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History. I'll say a quick word about them now. Derrick Cartwright is Associate Professor in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History, educated at Berkeley, UCLA, and University of Michigan, where he earned his PhD. He subsequently held museum directorial positions at Giovanni, Hanover, and Seattle, and is also Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Timken Museum in Balboa Park. Having taught at USD in the 1990s, he returned to us in 2012 to found and direct USD's system of galleries. Though stepping down from that role, Dr. Cartwright still oversees the operations of the Humanities Center gallery. His latest curatorial accomplishment is the remarkable Spectral Presences exhibition. It's a genuinely strange and unsettling show. Professor Cartwright's latest publication is the article Punchlines, Anguish and Humor in Wayne Thiebaud's Life Work. And that's just been published in the collection of essays, Wayne Thiebaud, A Radical Realism. The title of Derrick's talk this evening will be Anything's Better Than Home, Lucian Freud's Unheimlichkeit. Remi Dalton is a San Diego-based artist whose practice is centered around painting, but also includes video, mixed media, and installation. She received her MFA in painting from San Diego State University and has dual bachelor's degrees in visual arts and chemistry from USD. We love the science arts co-enrichment here. Professor Dalton recently completed a residency at Flux Factory in New York, made possible in part by an award from the Queen's Council of the Arts. She has received multiple awards and residencies, including the NTC Foundation's Emerging Artist Residency in San Diego and a Wingate Fellowship. She has shown in multiple exhibitions across the nation. The unnerving piece of art, Haunted Reflection, which is just over my shoulder here, was produced by a student in Remi's drawing class and has been something of an inspiration for this semester's work at the centre. So thank you, Remi, for putting that big spark in there. Remi's talk for us today is titled The Eyes of Furby, a Millennial Sensibility of the Uncanny. So here we go. At Halloween, we immerse ourselves in scary and frightening things. We decorate our houses with images of ghosts, witches, and skeletons. We visit haunted houses, which we hope will scare and frighten us delightfully. We visit a pumpkin patch, perhaps, so to buy a pumpkin that can be transformed into an archetypally scary jack-o'-lantern. We watch scary movies. We tell each other ghost stories. We dress up. And everything goes into full scare mode, even the most banal of things. I received an email this morning from Pep Boys, can you imagine, with the subject line, scary good tire deals. So everything sort of kicks into a kind of Halloween mode. Now, there are a range of things that produce the fears that we like at Halloween. The jump scares at the haunted mazes that we walk through, the slasher horror of such seasonal movies as Friday the 13th, and of course Halloween itself and its many, many sequels. But there is a distinct variety of the frightening that has almost uniquely captivated the imaginations of writers and thinkers. And this is the category of the uncanny. The artist Mike Kelly, whose work will be featured in the Humanities Center gallery in a couple of weeks, has captured the slow, creeping sense of dread that characterizes the uncanny by describing it as a muted sense of horror. A muted sense of horror. This is what he says. It's from an exhibition catalogue of a great exhibition on the uncanny that Kelly did. He says this: the uncanny is apprehended as a physical sensation. This sensation is tied to the act of remembering. I can still recall, as everyone can, certain strong, uncanny, aesthetic experiences I had as a child. Such past feelings, which recur even now in my recollection of them, seem to have been provoked by disturbing, unrecallable memories. The uncanny is a somewhat muted sense of horror, horror tinged with confusion. It produces goosebumps and is spine-tingling. It also seems related to déjà vu, the feeling of having experienced something before, the particulars of that previous experience being unrecallable, except as an atmosphere that was creepy or weird. But if it was such a loaded situation, so important, why can the experience not be remembered? I love this passage. It's really, really interesting. Of course, to characterize the uncanny in terms of unrecallable memories and experiences places us firmly in Freudian territory. And indeed, the locus classicus regarding this matter is Freud's remarkable essay from 1919, Das Unheimliche, commonly translated as the uncanny. Freud here wants to investigate what he calls the special core of feeling, typifying uncanniness. And he does this both by investigating the kinds of things, like the kinds of phenomena or literary devices which provoke that feeling, and by looking into the meaning of the word unheimlich itself to see if any clues can be found there. So just to orient ourselves to the phenomena, we can note some of the things that Freud feels fall into the category of the uncanny. So the feeling of déjà vu, and connected with this, any bizarre repetition. Here's Freud's example, getting lost in foggy woods, trying to get out, finding yourself back where you were. The idea of the double, or the doppelganger, the thought of being buried alive, the idea of dismemberment, particularly losing one's eyes, ghosts, hauntings, haunted houses, the return of the dead, and certain lifelike dolls and mechanical figures. Now, there's more that he adds to this list, but this gives you a sense of the territory, the central territory that we're looking at. And at the outset, I think it's worth, I say this to a period of time that is largely Freudophobic. It's worth registering that one can appreciate Freud's essay without having to accept or endorse the psychoanalytic explanation that Freud offers about the origin of uncanny impressions. For example, Mark Fisher, in a fascinating, quite recent book called The Weird and the Eerie, argues that the evocative appeal of Freud's essay on the uncanny lies not in his ultimate explanation of the phenomenon, which Fisher says is as disappointing as any mediocre genre detective's rote solution to a mystery. What holds us are the hesitations, conjectures, and rejected theses that populate Freud's twisting words. Moreover, as it says at the end here, what enduringly fascinates is the cluster of concepts that circulate in Freud's essay. And those enduring concepts are those things we have noted: being buried alive, the doll, the ghost, and the hold they have on Freud, and by extension on us. So with that said, we can take a brief look at Freud's linguistic investigation. We don't need to spend too much time on this. The translation and the literal meaning of unheimlich is unhomely, or unfamiliar, and is therefore the opposite of heimlich, homely, or heimisch, native, familiar. And thus, as Freud observes, we're tempted to conclude that what is uncanny is frightening because it is unfamiliar. That's a temptation that Freud wants to avoid. Freud wants to draw attention to those uses of the word heimlich which mean not simply homely, but rather concealed, kept from sight, secret. How the unclosed walls of the homely not only protect and make comfortable, but hide things too, something secret. And what he's trying to show is that the word Heimlich is ambiguous. It means both what is familiar and what is concealed. Here's an example he gives from a German dictionary. Freud, if you haven't read Freud's essay, you really should. It's this twisty, turny thing, including all sorts of definitions, encyclopedia extracts, and so on. So here's one example from a novel. The Zeks, this is a family name. There's a conversation between two people. The Zeks are all Heimlich. Heimlich? What do you understand by Heimlich? Well, they're like a buried spring or a dried-up pond. One cannot walk over it without always having the feeling that water might come up there again. Oh, we call it unheimlich. You call it heimlich. Well, what makes you think there's something secret and untrustworthy about this family? Freud makes a lot of this. He makes a lot of it because it demonstrates to him a convergence in the meaning of heimlich and unheimlich, homely and unhomely. These things that seem opposites are in fact for him connected. And even more significant for him is the definition of uncanny offered by the philosopher Friedrich Schelling. It's in itself a terrifying photograph. But Schelling, and Freud quotes this approvingly, unheimlich is the name for everything that ought to have remained secret and hidden, but has come to light. Everything that ought to have remained secret and hidden, but has come to light. With these two striking images in mind, water coming up from a dried spring, hidden things coming to light, Freud offers his suggestion. The uncanny, unheimlich, is something which is secretly familiar, heimlich, heimisch, which had undergone repression and then returned from it. Now, you'll be familiar with what Freud means by repression. It's the foundation of psychoanalytic thought, of course. Without going into too much detail, certain ideas, feelings, impulses, or experiences felt to be dangerous, distressing, damaging, or incompatible with one's consciously held set of values are disavowed, banished from consciousness. And they then take up residence in the realm of the inaccessible unconscious. And the crucial thing to register here is that what we repress has a tendency to come back and haunt us. And this thing, what Freud calls the return of the repressed, this, he feels, is what lies at the heart of uncanny sensations. So, Freud's contention is that an uncanny impression arises when the repressed contents of the unconscious return. Something reminds us of what has been disavowed or repressed, and this may then strike us as uncanny. And this accounts for the way in which something uncanny seems both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. It's familiar because we were formerly acquainted with it, and yet unfamiliar because it has been repressed or forgotten. In this sense, I suppose we can see why déjà vu might be the uncanny phenomenon par excellence. Because you have all experienced this, I presume. You're in a new situation, but you find it familiar. I've been here before. That weird feeling of being there before, even though it's new. This is uncanny. Now, there are two distinct groups of disavowed ideas that Freud wants to draw to our attention. Firstly, the repressed impressions of childhood, early childhood. And secondly, certain notions from the early history of our species that have been left behind, or, to use Freud's word, surmounted as a result of the advance of civilization. Now, in both of these cases, something happens which makes these impressions or beliefs re-emerge, resulting in the familiar, unfamiliar sensation characteristic of the uncanny. So, let's look at some examples. Starting with the repressed memories of childhood. Let's start there. You recall from our original uncanny list that idea of the lifelike doll, a doll that provokes uncertainty as to whether it is alive or inanimate. You find this everywhere. It's a staple, of course, of the horror genre. There's the perennial appeal of movies, and this is a tiny sampling of them, Dead Silence, Annabelle, Megan even. I don't know the extent to which these movies are uncanny. Megan may not be uncanny, but there are certain bits in it, certainly the way that even the film poster, I think, has an uncanny feel. This figure that looks sort of human but is mechanical. Artistic works also can produce that uncanny effect. Hans Bellmer's The Doll, perhaps being the most notable and horrifying example of this. This trope is central to Freud's essay on the uncanny, as it had been before him in the work of another psychologist, Ernst Jentsch. And both Freud and Jentsch direct our attention to a short story by E.T.A. Hoffmann called The Sandman, in which a young man falls in love with a beautiful yet oddly immobile young woman, who is in fact an automaton. I'm not going to say anything more about Hoffmann's tale. I have a feeling it may come up here. Possibly. Instead, I want to use as an example a short story by the great Daphne du Maurier. I love this picture of du Maurier. This is someone who really knew how to smoke with style. And if you're looking for good Halloween reading, it's not too late. There's a great collection of Daphne du Maurier's unnerving short stories has just been published in the last 2 or 3 weeks, with a very good introduction by Stephen King himself, who loves du Maurier's work. In The Doll, this is a story I just want to think about. A man becomes obsessively infatuated with a young violinist called Rebecca. If you're familiar with Daphne du Maurier's oeuvre, you'll see this is a name that du Maurier seems to be attracted towards. Rebecca in this story is somewhat terrifyingly described, and I quote, "great white fanatical eyes like a saint." This is brilliant. The narrow mouth that hid her teeth, sharp and white as ivory, and a halo of savage hair, electric, dark, uncontrolled. He falls in love with her. The problem is that Rebecca has a secret lover called Julio. Here is how he is introduced. Rebecca rose and went slowly across the room to the door I had never seen opened. She looked oddly pale as she stood there, her mass of queer, savage hair springing from her head, her hand on the knob of the door. "I want to introduce you to Julio," she said. I left my chair and went toward her. I had no idea what she was talking about. She took my hand and then opened the door. I saw a low, round-shaped room whose walls were draped with some sort of velvet hangings, as if to deaden any sound, and long, thick curtains were drawn across the window. There was a log fire, but it had burned very low. Near the fireplace was a divan, covered with cushions thrown anyhow, and the only light came from a small shaded lamp, thus leaving the room in half darkness. There was one chair in the room, and this was facing the divan. Something was sitting in the chair. That's a terrifying line. Something, not someone, something was sitting in the chair. The thing is described as the most evil-looking thing the narrator has ever seen. A face, I quote, ashen pale, the mouth, a crimson gash, sensual and depraved, the eyes cruel, gleaming and narrow, and curiously still. For a while it appears to be a boy in his late teens, but it then becomes clear that it's a doll. Rebecca's lover is a doll, and the narrator's violent jealousy erupts to an absolutely appalling conclusion. It's a great story. It's perfect for Halloween. Now, for Freud, the root of the uncanny effect of a tale such as Du Maurier's and of other stories involving oddly animated dolls lies in forgotten childhood experiences. The child treats its doll as though it is alive, as though a relationship can be formed with the doll. When that infantile thought is revived by a story like this, or an image like Belma's doll, we experience an uncanny feeling. Something old has returned to our mind, something simultaneously familiar and unfamiliar. As I said, Freud holds that the return of childhood complexes is only one of two sources of the uncanny. The second source is to be found not in the childhood of the individual, but in what some writers called the childhood of the species, the long-surmounted beliefs of our long-dead ancestors. At our stage of civilization, a great many of the beliefs of our primitive ancestors have been left behind. They have been surmounted, to use that term again. Occasionally, however, these beliefs re-emerge. And this challenges our secular, naturalistic, and scientific convictions. One such re-emergent thing, capable of producing fear and terror in us, is perhaps the most uncanny thing of all: death. The return of the dead, spirits and ghosts. You can think here about the haunted house, which significantly is in German called an unheimlich house, or literally an unhomely house. Houses with a reputation of being haunted have a capacity, still, to scare us, or at least to make us feel uneasy. Many of us, I imagine, will recall walking warily in our hometown past an abandoned house with a haunted reputation. I think also about the idea of buying a house, trying to establish a warm home there, and then feeling that there's something off in it, something wrong. Well, that's terrifying. And of course, that's also a staple of the Hollywood Halloween genre too. There is, I suppose, something especially terrible about the idea of the haunted house, not just because ghosts are frightening. Rather, the very idea of a haunted house subverts all of our warmest feelings about home. that with the haunted house, home becomes unhomely, and what is or should be most safe and familiar to us, our home, becomes markedly unfamiliar. And thus you have that conjunction again of the familiar and the unfamiliar, which is definitive of the uncanny. So why do ghost stories produce an uncanny impression on us? Freud's answer to this question goes like this. With regard to death, he thinks, our feelings hardly differ from those of our ancestors centuries ago. Death troubles and mystifies us, and no human being can truly grasp their own mortality. Freud says, since almost all of us still think as savages do on this topic, it's not surprising that the primitive fear of the dead is still so strong within us and ready to come to the surface on any provocation. It is this atavistic element of our personality which accounts for our uneasiness when hearing tales of ghosts and the supernatural, while we feel uneasy sleeping in a hotel room deemed to be haunted, even though we have ostensibly passed beyond the belief that the dead return to trouble us. We can talk about this in the Q&A bit, I think. It's an odd thing. There's your daytime self that doesn't believe this stuff, and then you're alone at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you can say goodbye to your rational self. This should suggest to us that the uncanny is, culturally speaking, a borderline or liminal experience. It exists on the boundary between the animistic and the scientific worldviews. Here's Freud on the return of the dead. We, or our primitive forefathers, once believed that these possibilities were realities and were convinced that they actually happened. Nowadays, we no longer believe in them. We have surmounted these modes of thought, but we do not feel quite sure of our new beliefs. And the old ones still exist within us, ready to seize upon any confirmation. As soon as something actually happens in our lives which seems to confirm the old discarded beliefs, we get a feeling of the uncanny. It is as though we were making a judgment something like this. So, the dead do live on and appear on the scene of their former activities. Conversely, anyone who has completely and finally rid himself of animistic beliefs will be insensible to this type of the uncanny. So, in closing, I'll say this. The uncanny is a byproduct, a kind of toxic side effect of some kind of advance. We feel that we have rid ourselves of archaic and infantile beliefs, and that we occupy safer, more adult, more rational territory. But these older beliefs just remain dormant within us, ready to return in creepy and unnerving ways. And this indicates to Freud that we are not fully at home in this world. We occupy a space that is neither fully animistic, based on spirits, nor fully scientific. It's a kind of psychical and cultural no man's land in which we are vulnerable to the horror of our apparently outgrown beliefs. And with that, I want to invite Derrick to follow up on further Freudian stuff. There were different Freud altogether.
That was super. I want to start by thanking Brian and Lindy and Maggie for inviting me to talk in this series. It's great to be on a panel with Remi as well, and as you, Brian. In an uncanny way, I'm going to avoid some repetitions because I have a few observations and Brian has made them already, so I'll go quickly over those and not test your patience. But the title of this talk is Anything is Better Than Home, which is a quote from a letter that Lucian Freud wrote at a time that he was being thrown out of one of many public schools that he attended in London, and believed, I think, very strongly that anything was better than home. But in a curious, not to say uncanny way, this is going to be a talk about translation. The translation of Lucian Freud's anxious but not really awkward German self into the vaunted position he ultimately occupied at the pinnacle of mainstream British art. And because I'm interested in translation almost in the same way that Brian was, I wanted to sort of map this etymological connection between hominess, hometown, and this state of weirdness, which we've just heard that Sigmund Freud identifies as the uncanny. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I think it wouldn't be hard if this was a talk about Lucian's mature work to show how the artist worked in this uncanny way throughout his career. So you look at a painting like this large interior or sunny morning, 8 legs, and you start to see these things that don't cohere in any kind of natural way. This isn't a talk about Lucian Freud's mature work, however. It's a talk about a much earlier stage that he recovers, perhaps, in these later works, when he slid deliberately into ambiguity. I think it's also tempting, in a way that Brian has nicely set the stage for us, to connect what Lucian Freud did with the work of his grandfather. This has been the task of a lot of art historians who've wanted to see a relationship between his practice and what his grandfather produced. And it would be fun for me to also map Sigmund Freud's ideas about the uncanny with what I see Lucian doing at an early point in his career. But except to signal that I think some of the things Brian has already said are relevant, I'm not going to dwell on that. Instead, I think it's important to know that there was a relationship between Lucian and his grandfather, although he periodically denied any influence by him. He liked to refer to his grandfather as this amiable, old, smart guy whom he knew as a teenager, but ultimately he says, I didn't read him, didn't want to have anything to do with him, didn't want to know that body of knowledge that Brian has just shared with us. So there's this almost self-conscious denial, is I think the Freudian way to think of it, of the relationship between these two men. And I guess I wanted to creep back in this early phase of Freud's work, which I'm going to now delve into. I think the Freuds did share a vital family bond, and that Sigmund was really happy with his grandson's decision to become an artist. He was indulgent and supportive of Lucian's choice of a career path, and certainly through his royalties, which he left his children, he supported him in a way that meant that he really never had to work for a living, because all of the money from the sale of Freud's books went to Lucian and his brothers and his other cousins. But we know from Freud's biographers that he was not above associating with his grandfather when it was convenient for him. So he used to walk around London in his grandfather's gray overcoat, and he wanted to make sure everybody knew that that was his grandfather's coat. And it shows up even in a late painting like this Night Interior of 1968. That's that gray coat in the closet that's just opened for our view. And I don't think these are accidents of Freud's practice. But I want to assert 3 things in this talk. And the first is that this relationship between Lucian and Sigmund Freud is complex, and it's surprisingly underexplored. And it will take more than one short talk to correct that oversight, but I want to at least signal some ways in which it could be disrupted. His early work, and I mean Lucian's early work, is likewise understudied and underappreciated. This owes something to the comparatively greater attention that has been paid to his later career and his rather large afterlife in the art market. And lastly, the uncanny dimensions of Lucian's early works are a reflection of his lived experience. Specifically, these representations record Lucian's deep discomfort as a recently arrived immigrant in England during World War II and the immediate post-war years. And like his lifelong German accent, uncanny qualities, das Unheimliche, never fully disappeared from that worldview. Lucian's father, Ernst, an architect, talking to another emigre artist, Lucy Ree, a fantastic ceramicist of the mid-century in England, once claimed his son was a wild animal. Wildness notwithstanding, Lucy Ree never liked Lucian. And the description that he gave seems apt, and I just want to sort of prove this for you. When Lucian arrived in England at age 12 from his home in Berlin with two brothers, one older, one younger, speaking very little English. He found himself a student first at Dartington Hall School, where he felt deeply unwelcome by the British public school boys. And despite that school's progressive approach to teaching, he fell out very quickly. He was told not to return to a campus, and his father found a way to get him to a still more prestigious school, the Bryanston School, again, just for one academic year before he was thrown out, at which point he went to the East Anglian School of Drawing, which I'm showing you at the bottom, which he promptly burned to the ground with a cigarette. So Freud's poor record as a student, it's well documented. I'm not making this stuff up. He left Bryanston after turning 16, according to William Fever, having exhausted the school's tolerance. When his father wrote to formally withdraw Lucien, having received a letter that he needed to change everything, his friends, his behavior, his subjects, in order to be allowed to return in the fall, Ernst wrote, "I have to thank you very much for your kind suggestion to allow Lucien to return after the holiday," which really wasn't what was being offered. In the meantime, we had the opportunity to think over the situation and to discuss it with him, and ultimately have decided to keep Lux, that was his nickname, at home. I'm very sorry that Lux's career, which he spelled carrier, at Bryanston has ended so suddenly, but I feel sure it was his fault entirely. So leaving Bryanston and burning down the East Anglian School coincided in Lucien's life with the loss of his grandfather, Sigmund, who succumbed to a terrible form of mouth cancer after a long and debilitating illness just a year after leaving Vienna for London. Sigmund referred to his last days with characteristic pessimism, feeling he was, quote, "a small island of pain floating in an ocean of indifference," end quote. And Lucien visited his grandfather weekly during the last months of his life, but refused to attend the funeral, which caused a great deal of consternation within the family itself. But he paints these works at this time that I think are worthy of considering how different they are from that mature work that we know. They're these almost naive, childlike images which have a kind of poignancy to them. This one's called The Refugees, and it's hard not to think about it in some relationship to his own experience as a refugee, but also his knowledge of the German new objectivity, the neue Sachlichkeit, which he had left behind, and which his grandfather had made sure he was acquainted with before he left Berlin. This is a letter that Lucien wrote to his doting mother at the same time, and he always sort of colored his letters in this almost psychedelic approach and recounts. You can see there's just a little sketch of that painting on the left, and it says, "Das gibt dir Hoffte, du kannst." It gives you hope that you could do it, right? That you could do something like this. A work like Refugees begs to be understood in terms of displacement and estrangement that Lucien must have felt as a young Jewish man struggling to fit in amongst the aristocratic offspring at public schools like Dartington and Bryanston. Strangeness becomes an unshakable attribute of his art making. The most notable work that Lucien produced during these years is this three-legged horse. It's almost unique within his entire lifetime career as an artist to have produced this sculpture. And many myths about this now lost figure exist, but it seems sure that it's earned its maker a place in art school. It's what he was used as a diploma piece, really, to get into the art schools after he flunked out of all the other academic arrangements. Another story that accompanies it is that his mother liked it so much that he broke off a leg, hence it's a three-legged horse, as a practice of spite towards her. This act of disfigurement puts the work in the category of the uncanny, as we shall soon see. And horses, which were apparently the only thing that kept Lucien going in his tumultuous years as a student, caring for these horses at Dartington and Bryanston, they appear frequently in this early work that I'm interested in. But really, the period of time that I want to spend most of what remains in this talk with you is to look at what happens in 10 years between the first exhibition that Lucien Freud has as a young artist in London, which took place in 1944, and his arrival on the British art scene as the representative of England at the Venice Biennale in 1954. So in 10 years, going from absolute obscurity to the very highest honor he could have received as a British artist at this time. So let's see. This is a view of the studio that Lucian kept at Denomere Street in London. You have to know Denomere Street was a really shabby part of town, and it was maybe the worst part of town. His father in this post-war years wanted him to have a respectable art studio and would have paid for it, but instead he was really happy paying 20 shillings a week to be in this place, which he populated with, it's interesting to me, these couches like his grandfather's analytic couch, and also most notably this zebra head, which appears again and again as these works. And I'm thinking about Brian's comments about these stuffed dolls and things like that. It's clear that the zebra head for Freud plays that kind of role. It later shows up when Tim Mira did this short play called Small Gestures in Bare Rooms, and Lucian Freud made a cameo appearance recreating that studio scene. They actually brought a live zebra in to stand in the doorway, and apparently it was a very patient beast because it stood there for the whole performance. But these stuffed things that show up in Lucian's work relate back to what Brian was talking about in this definition of the uncanny. And we know that Lucian Freud in this time was a great admirer of the Surrealist works, who were also in their way great admirers of mannequins and automatons, as you can see from this display of the first international, or sorry, not the first, but the International Surrealist Exhibition in Paris in 1938. This quote, which I think Brian has already referred to before, so I'm not going to reread it for you, is one way to understand these works that Lucian produces at this time. It's not clear to me anyway that that rabbit is alive or dead, and I think the reading of the painting itself depends on whether you want to feel sympathetically towards it or to understand that it is a dead creature. We know that Lucian was a busy customer at pet stores for the dead critters that did not survive, and he would take them back to his studio, and then they were wonderful models for him, like this lobster. There's a kind of intense scrutiny of these subjects that I think comes close to the uncanny as Brian's described it for us. And then there are again these dolls that show up like this hand puppet, which seem to grow right out of that E.T.A. Hoffman Sandman short story, which Brian referenced. But it's these pictures of dead things that populate his work in the 1940s, right up to about 1950, that I think are some of his most powerful and disturbing works, and certainly fall for me into this category of the uncanny. And it's also for Sigmund Freud was the definition of what the uncanny might look like to someone today. The critics who saw these works hated them. They said, you know, the human form defeats Lucian Freud because he does not observe it as he does the dead birds. Right? Those were the things that he could spend his time looking at and actually, I think, provide some of the most startling works of this time period. Certainly this Dead Monkey of 1944, or its brother. Here are the kind of works that I think inhabit this uncanny moment in his career. It's Freud who says, animism, magic, and witchcraft, the omnipotence of thoughts, man's attitude toward death, involuntary repetition, and the castration complex comprise practically all the factors which turn something fearful into an uncanny thing. But he also says a living person could be that uncanny thing too. Usually we ascribe evil motives to him, but that is not all. We must not only credit him with bad intentions, but must attribute to these intentions the capacity to achieve their aim in virtue of certain special powers. And in this regard, I just want to sort of reference a whole series of descriptions that accumulate around Lucian Freud where people called him a witch, where he was likened by people who desired him as a partner, that he was totally live, like something not entirely human, a leprechaun, a changeling child, or if there is a male equivalent, a witch. That's Stephen Spender describing Lucian at this time. And he had this kind of magnetic appeal that troubled people. I think that's the best way to think about it. And certainly in these self-portraits as Actaeon here on the left, and in this sort of framing of himself as a subject, he's really giving in to that notion that he's some other kind of being. And I want to just end very quickly by looking at this transition which takes place in Lucian Freud's work right about 1950. He gets married to first Kitty Garman here, and there's this wonderful group of portraits which he does, but they all have a sort of level of violence to them, which is completely surprising given how warm a person she was. If the girl with a kitten were allowed to move, she would strangle it. That is, she would strangle that kitten, right? She would be this sort of source of great pain, and that's what Lucian Freud chooses to create in this moment right before he receives the invitation to go to the Venice Biennale. Or I think even more powerfully in this portrait of his close friend, Francis Bacon, which was likened to a picture of someone who has just swallowed a hand grenade about to go off. I think is the perfect description of this painting and what Freud captures about the intensity of this relationship that he has. In 1954, as I say, he gets this surprising invitation to show his work alongside of Ben Nicholson and Francis Bacon at the Venice Biennale. He accepts it, but not before he rushes to complete a group of paintings done on his second honeymoon with his wife, Lady Caroline Blackwood, who's shown here in this hotel bedroom is the name of this work, which is about as uncomfortable a honeymoon picture as I could possibly imagine. And it's during these years that people start turning to Freud and sort of identifying him as a talent beyond the talents of his grandfather and start to think of him as somebody who is capable of producing a body of work that's completely different. And I think in this letter he's writing to the person who invited him to show at the Biennale. He says, I'm back in Paris and I've got to work on this painting to get it in there. It's this really troubling, it seems to me, image of Lady Caroline Blackwood, who is a really beautiful woman. In addition to being an heiress to the Guinness beer fortune, she was this tremendous beauty and sensitive, a great writer for her own part. But when she looked back on these paintings, she says, the results are only half me, right? After all, it was Lucian's version to turn her into this sort of worried, fretting figure on the eve of her marriage. Lucian's greatest period of uncanniness might be found in the stretch of works that have mostly been overlooked by art historians. Overlooked because they don't match the monumentality and sensationalism of the artist's late celebrated efforts. The quiet, unnerving quality of these small works with prone figures, for some prone because dead, and for others seeming to perform lifelessness, the artist mined ideas that he shared with his grandfather, and today we recognize those ideas as uncommon, unhomey, uncanny. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Remi. Thank you so much to Brian and the Humanities Center. Thank you so much. A little shorter. For hosting what's been a really enjoyable series, and I'm very honored to speak with you and Derrick today. So yes, I'm here to talk about Furby. One night in the winter of 1998 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, my granddad bought me a Furby. He was a cool granddad for doing this because this animatronic toy was a hot commodity. Tiger Electronics sold 40 million Furbies between the years of 1998 and 2000. My relationship with Furby was marked by curiosity, care, and a certain sense of respect, meaning I was low-key scared of him. Did anyone in here ever own a Furby? Okay, a couple. Oh, several. Okay, love that. Were you ever creeped out by Furby? Unanimous. Okay, well, there you go. Supporting my thesis. Yeah, in the world of millennial uncanny, the figure of Furby stands Goliath. I'm going to draw parallels between Furby and Ideas the Uncanny by Ernst Jentsch and Sigmund Freud, which is not difficult. As we can see, Furby is creepy. He is also a totem in my art practice. I graduated from San Diego State's Master of Fine Arts program in 2019. There I developed friendships with artists who also explore the domestic artifacts and spaces from our 90s childhoods. These spaces and objects, to quote my friend Juan Cabrera, who is in attendance, can be both wombs of protection, but also in different vaults of anxiety and uncanny horror. By giving you a brief look into Juan's, Jordan, and my own artwork, I hope to give you a taste of what exactly a millennial sensibility of the uncanny might be. It's worthwhile to ponder this because it gives us the feel for the anxieties that plague a generation, a sense of what keeps us up at night. You can see from our photos that we're a really outgoing bunch. We would never hide behind our work here. Getting back to Furby, Furby senses movement and touch. In response, he moves his eyes, ears, and speaks. Furby comes speaking his own language called Furbish, and gradually incorporates English to give the appearance that he's learning from you. It wasn't just me who was creeped out by Furby, which we've seen here, but urban legends abounded about Furby in my childhood neighborhood and beyond. The National Security Agency banned Furby from Fort Meade in 1999 for surveillance concerns. Jentsch, in his essay on the psychology of the uncanny, says that in telling a story, one of the most successful devices, which we've all touched on, for creating uncanny effects is to leave the reader in an uncertainty, whether a particular figure in the story is a human being or an automaton. Jentsch brings this up in an analysis of E.T.A. Hoffman's story, which we've all touched on too, The Sandman. This story contains the character of Olympia, an automaton that the main character, Nathaniel, becomes infatuated with. I agree with Jentsch that my own uncertainty over Furby's aliveness made him an uncanny object. MIT sociologist Sherry Turkle has done some really fascinating work regarding human relationships with animatronic toys and computer programs. In 2004, she followed 30 elementary-aged children she gave Furbies to. The children developed caretaker relationships with their Furbies, going so far as to not expect replacement Furbies if theirs were damaged or broken because they preferred their own Furby to be repaired. You know, had a unique personality for them. It was their baby. In an interview with one of her 7-year-old subjects, Turkle asked the child if Furby was alive. The 7-year-old replied that Furby is alive for Furby. Turkle uses experiences like these to argue that we need a new theory and language of object relations. Furby appears to respond to your care, but he doesn't understand any of it. However, that doesn't stop him from manipulating our behavior. Take my own mother, for example, who would play with Furby if she woke him up while cleaning my room because she felt bad for him. The authenticity of our relationship with Furby is a key concern for Turkle. There is authentic feeling from our part, but not on Furby's. Turkle says we must develop language and ethics to navigate these new relationships. It's notable that Turkle sounded this alarm in a paper published in 2007. Today, a recent report by Brigham Young University's Wheatley Institute found that 19% of adults in the United States have chatted with an AI romantic partner. It seems incredibly important now to heed Turkle's warnings and develop a new vocabulary for dealing with the question of authenticity in these relationships. But getting back to Freud and Furby. Freud, in the 1919 Essay on the Uncanny, agrees with Jentsch's assertion that confusion over Olympia, the automaton's agency in the Sandman story, is a source of uncanniness. But he dives further into the story to consider another terrifying theme, which is the Sandman tearing out children's eyes. Freud highlights the anxieties we have from childhood of damaging our eyes. He goes on to say that the fear of losing one's eyes is often a substitute for the dread of castration. I don't know if I'll go that far with it, but yes, the theme does make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I find Furby's eyes entrancing in a vacant sort of way, and this is by design. One of the co-creators of Furby, Caleb Chung, discussed the design process of Furby's eyes with the host of Radiolab, Jab Abumrad, in a 2018 episode of the program called More or Less Human. He describes the decision to make Furby's eyes move up and down as opposed to side, because he says, while side-to-side eye movement can appear kind of shifty, up and down mirrors a child looking up at its mother. I'm sure Freud would have a lot to say about the mommy thing with Furby, but let's get back to the uncanny thing of having the eyes stolen. Once people know you're fascinated by Furby, you receive a lot of Furby internet content, and it's a lot. I won't subject you to all of it, but trust me when I say that tearing out Furby's eyes is a common theme. One small but vocal internet community is the long Furby community. Members of this subculture rip out Furby's eyes and sew them onto new terrifying forms, many of them elongated, hence the name. Social media sites dedicated to the craftsmanship of this community are full of uncanny images, and yet also contain a wholesome dedication to craft and memory. I like how Metro reporter James Grieg puts it in a 2019 article on the long Furby scene, which he was researching. It all seems refreshingly free of cynicism. No one gets involved in the long Furby scene for social clout, and the people involved are unlikely to be doing any corporate partnerships anytime soon. In fact, it represents a kind of anti-aspirationalism. Posting a picture of a spider Furby with skeleton hands is about as far removed from a beach selfie as it's possible to get. The level of creativity on display is also admirable. But that said, I would still round up every single one of these foul creatures, burn them in a fire, and then salt the earth so they may never return. Keep them the hell away from me. Yeah, I agree. The long Furbies are very creepy. Freud says it may be true that the uncanny is nothing else than a hidden familiar thing that has undergone repression, as Brian talked about, and then emerged from it. That everything uncanny fulfills this condition. Becoming an adult meant repressing my belief that Furby was real and letting go of the guilt I had for not feeding it every day. But when I'm presented with images or stories which lead me to believe just for a second that I was wrong and Furby is alive, it's deeply unsettling for me. At the end of grad school, I had a late onset of Furbomania. I painted Furby a lot. You can see here multiple Furby paintings, including a 6-foot painting behind me called Furpocalypse. I went on YouTube and made a tutorial to make sure everybody else knew how to paint Furby. This is a lucky winner of a Furby giveaway I had at my art studio. Furby became a kind of totem for me, a spiritual, significant object of my suburban childhood, which protected me. I referenced him often in a series of paintings, which I called dream rooms. You can see in this one, there's 2 Furbies above the couch there. Emojis and Instagram notifications also adorn this interior. For this Dream Room series, I cast myself as a kind of Norma Desmond from the movie Sunset Boulevard. For those who haven't seen the movie, Norma Desmond is a character who is a washed-up movie star who's lost touch with reality, and she lives in isolation pretending she's still a huge celebrity. One of my favorite scenes of the movie is Norma being interrupted while having a funeral for her pet chimp in her house. It's interesting to compare the ethics and authenticity of Norma's relationship with her chimp to my relationship with Furby. I'm sure Furby didn't mind being in captivity as much. Norma's mansion is cluttered with glamorous headshots and luxurious but out-of-fashion items. She's created a self-serving, glamorous prison for herself, which a lot of us did during the pandemic, but mostly on our social media pages. In this time, 2020, I began creating pieces which sought to create my own ecstatic prisons that blended the digital, physical, and childhood fantasy. These domestic layers explored conflicting desires of isolation and community. there's an element of messed up Barbie dream house to them. While at first glance these paintings appear very colorful and inviting, offbeat, uncanny details reveal themselves upon inspection. We can see in this piece a silk-robed figure appearing from the darkness. In the corner of the mirror, a hysterical, faded YouTuber crying. The notifications and emojis that enter into these domestic spaces point to fears of stalking and surveillance. Emojis, which are oftentimes seen as very flippant or inauthentic, are paired with things like your grandma's couch to bring you to a liminal space that investigates the relationship between the domestic and the online. The project reflected my own confusion about the sincerity of online spaces. In addition to painting, I was creating YouTube videos and live stream performances in which I was physically painting inside of a dream room-like space and broadcasting them on Twitch, which is a website that hosts live video. Basically, I was trying to live inside of one of my paintings. The whole project culminated in a 2-week Twitch live stream in which I lived and worked in my tiny Queens studio. My everyday studio painting was broadcast to anyone on the internet who cared to watch or comment. We also projected the stream onto the wall of the building, which you can see there. It was an awful, claustrophobic, reality-bending experience in which the domestic, creative, public, and online spaces were totally fused. I do not recommend. It gave new meaning to haunted house for me. Imagine phantoms hurling anonymous comments at you constantly, and you have an idea of what it was like. In this piece, Another Dream Room, I include the title of a YouTube video called My Sugar Daddy Died and Haunted Me, which is a real YouTube video I watched. Through a gallery in LA, I was connected to the YouTuber who made the video. And we had this conversation where she thanked me for creating an earnest art piece with her title instead of, in her words, making fun of her or making a meme like everyone else. I think this interaction points to an uncanny aspect of the internet. Clickbait, rage bait, and authentic personal history are indecipherable. Now more than ever, it's harder to judge what is real on the internet. The internet is filled with inauthentic, greedy attempts to extract attention, but they're mixed with real gems of truth. I think the uncanny experience is a really useful tool for artists because it mirrors the state of confusion. As Yinch says, the better orientated in his environment the person is, the less readily he will get the impression of something uncanny in regards to the objects and events in it. We all know from scary movies that the characters who react to uncanny things with overconfidence die immediately. I think the language of the uncanny in art is a great way to coax viewers to experience things sensually rather than judgmentally. I really admire the work of David Lynch in this respect. Often in his films, the confusions between suburban sweetness, dark forces of the underworld, sincerity, and soap opera is never totally resolved. But we're here to talk about millennials, so let's get back to a local millennial artist and my friend and studio mate, Juan Cabrera. Juan's work also explores domestic space, but obviously with a lot more visual restraint than me. This is a watercolor painting on paper. Because of Juan's mastery of both watercolor and printmaking, he's able to manipulate the mediums to resemble each other in unintelligible, maybe uncanny ways. I love Juan's paintings of condos and apartments. They stoke my own memories of rooms I've been in my past. Brownstones, farmhouses, and mansions aren't the only places with roots, histories, and ghosts, right? What other personal histories haunt the one-bedroom apartments on Craigslist? Which, by the way, when I met Juan, he was drawing rooms listed for rent on Craigslist. Juan as a child would accompany his mom, who cleaned offices at night. These dark, muffled, gleaming spaces sparked his imagination. What could be around the next dark corner? Through this type of childlike wonder, things as mundane as waiting rooms can take on an uncanny tension. Crisp objects paired with objects that seem to be caught in the act of shifting bring the viewer into a liminal space of disassociation. While spaces are cold and corporate, we can almost feel a beating heart somewhere or the fuzzy memory of someone who used to visit the place. Sometimes I think Juan's work looks like someone photographing the very sincere spirit of a really artificial place. Another source for inspiration for Juan is the liminal space in video games, which you can see referenced in the work. Nintendo's PlayStation and PC games are another interesting artifact from the 90s that has wound itself into a millennial sensibility of the uncanny. Endless loops of video game space can create really eerie feelings. Horror video games such as Silent Hill are drilled into our memories. The uncanny effects of video games and surveillance footage are referenced in a mix of printmaking and watercolor treatments of Juan's work. If you'd like to see Juan's work in real life, he has some new work up at the Miracosta Gallery in Oceanside, which will be open to the public until early December, I think. Finally, in the brief time we have left, I just want to touch upon the work of Jordan Reeves, another colleague of mine in grad school. Jordan hails from West Virginia and now works in North Carolina. When I met him at State, he was undergoing a really similar fascination with a childhood object as I was with Furby. He was casting this gargoyle from his childhood room over and over again. Jordan's work often deals with an uncanny repetition and references the domestic, as you can see in this untitled sculpture in which his own bust is staring at himself. The quality of craftsmanship of his sculptures paired with the surreal subject matter allow viewers to bounce between the imaginary and the real. This sculpture references that weird feeling of trying to operate a telephone in a dream. You can see the cord coming out the back, just going nowhere. I find a lot of Jordan's work very visceral. I can feel this ghostly seated figure's trepidation and discomfort better than I can intellectualize it. Also, I'm pretty sure Jordan has given me a haunted sculpture. He gave me a mini version of this one before he left for Carolina, and I had a scary sleep paralysis experience with it. I left a rosary around it for a little while, and it seemed to help clear things up. So Jordan's work activates the sensation of the domestic uncanny experience in the viewer's body. Juan's work forces you to grapple with the transformation of uncanny space. My work asks you to examine the uncanny digital prisons we so often find ourselves in. The toys, games, and spaces of the 90s have evolved into sophisticated tools of surveillance capitalism that evoke authentic human emotion with artificial behavior. Meditating on the millennial sensibility of the uncanny hopefully inspires a more nuanced conversation around how to navigate our current landscape by acknowledging anxieties in our past. As technology, art, and architecture seek to become frameless, totally immersive, it is now more important than ever to consider the function of the frame. Instead of rushing out of the uncanny valley, maybe we should stay a while and collect ourselves in it. Thank you very much.